The first direct peace talks in years between Ukraine and Russia are set to begin without Vladimir Putin. The Russian president's name is not on a list of delegates the Kremlin says will attend the Istanbul talks. The Ukrainian president is said to be headed for Turkey, but it's not clear whether he'll be taking part in the talks either. Meanwhile, in the Turkish city of Antalya, the Ukrainian foreign minister, Andrii, Sybiha, has met with the US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, and Senator Lindsey. The senator is preparing a list of sanctions on Russia, which would be implemented if the US becomes convinced that President Putin is not serious about ending the war in Ukraine. Earlier, I spoke to DW's Rebecca Ritters, who's in Kyiv, and DW's Sergei Satanovskii, who is reporting from Riga. I started by asking Sergei if we know why the Russian president won't be attending those peace talks with Ukraine.
That's a good question, especially given that it was Vladimir Putin himself who called for this meeting in his late-night address last Sunday. The Kremlin hasn't officially explained why exactly Putin won't be in Istanbul, but state TV hosts are filling in the gaps. For example, on one of the propaganda shows yesterday, one of the hosts said the talks in Istanbul are just not on Putin's level. In other words, from the Kremlin's point of view, from the state TV point of view, discussions about a prisoner exchange or a temporary ceasefire or whatever is going to be discussed in Istanbul today don't require the Russian president's at least personal involvement.
All right, Rebecca, President Zelensky says he wants to negotiate with Putin directly. He's made that very clear. Now that's clearly not going to happen. How is Ukraine viewing these talks?
Well, I think, Ukraine is viewing these talks much in the same way that they have been all along. President Zelensky and the Ukrainian side have continuously framed these talks as a way for President Vladimir Putin to show his true colours, in their words, when it comes to a ceasefire and a peace deal. And I think that they will be singing from that same songbook in the fact that by not turning up to talks that, as you just heard Sergei say there, were set by Vladimir Putin, that he really is showing how serious he is when it comes to ceasefire negotiations. They've consistently said that he's just buying time, wasting time, as it were, and I think the Ukrainians will feel much the same. Whether or not President Zelensky joins in these talks remains to be seen. He did say in his nightly address that he's prepared for any format of negotiations, but he has consistently said that he'll only meet with Vladimir Putin, and obviously Vladimir Putin's not attending, but of course the Ukrainians could send a lower-level delegation to meet with the Russians, and of course the Americans will also be in Turkey, and it's likely that discussions will be going on some level, though it remains to be seen whether Zelensky will, of course, get involved personally.
So if we look at the members of the Russian delegation, Sergei, do you think Russia is taking these talks at all seriously?
Well, indeed, the delegation doesn't include Vladimir Putin or even Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, which was discussed just yesterday in the press. So the delegation doesn't look as high level as it could. On the other hand, it's being led by Putin's aide, former conservative culture minister Vladimir Medinsky. He also headed the Russian delegation during the talks with Ukraine in the spring of 2022. And at that time, Putin was reportedly satisfied with how those discussions were going. Today's meeting in Istanbul is seen by the Kremlin as a direct continuation or another round of those early interrupted negotiations. We also see that members of the General Staff and the Defense Ministry of Russia are part of the negotiations. So it might be a sign that the situation on the battlefield is likely to be on the agenda as well.
The Ukrainian president has thanked Ukraine's allies, who he says are now putting pressure on Russia, so the shelling finally stops. Rebecca, is there any sense that this pressure is working, is having an effect?
Well, militarily, Anya, we've been seeing a pretty similar situation. We haven't seen a hell of a lot of change. Even over the 3 days, the unilateral ceasefire or pause in fighting that President Vladimir Putin of Russia called over his May 9 Victory Day celebrations, we still saw battles ongoing on the front lines. There were fewer or almost no sirens or no shelling within the greater Ukraine, but we were seeing fighting continue on the battlefield, and that's something we've been seeing continue as well. There were sirens in Kyiv last night, though nothing landed, but there has been shelling and drone attacks in western parts of Ukraine. So there's certainly fewer attacks than we were seeing a few weeks ago, and that could be in direct relation because of these ceasefire talks. But I think that the main progress that's been made here is on the diplomatic level. These talks are something that we wouldn't have, they're almost unthinkable just a few weeks ago, and now they are in some form or another taking place. There's a lot of discussion around this ceasefire, and I think, Zelensky sort of certainly trying to bat the ball back in Putin's court and sort of bring the attention back to the fact that the Ukrainians are trying to be the grown-ups here in the room, and that Putin is being belligerent. So certainly some movement on the diplomatic front, but militarily we're seeing much the same.
I'll have to leave it there, but thanks so much to both of you. That's Rebecca Ritters reporting from Kyiv and Sergei Satanovskii in Riga. Thank you. All right, and we can get more on this from our correspondent in Istanbul, Julia Hahn. Julia, Putin and Trump are not in Istanbul. Zelensky is there, but he's not going to be attending these talks. So what realistic expectations can we have from these negotiations?
Well, there have been speculations here in Turkey too for days. Will Putin come or won't he? Where exactly will the talks be held and in which format? And now that we've seen who is making up that Russian delegation, a group of experienced technocrats, basically, I think everybody expects these technical level talks, but not the big political bang that Ukraine's leader Zelensky was hoping for when he said he would wait here in Istanbul personally for Vladimir Putin. Let's not forget it was Putin who proposed these direct talks without any preconditions here in Istanbul this week in response to Ukraine and its European allies' demand for a 30-day ceasefire. Now, the fact that Putin is not here and will probably not show up, it's certainly seen by Ukraine and its allies as just another sign that Russia does not want peace. Now, Volodymyr Zelensky, for his part, he is expected in the Turkish capital Ankara today for a meeting with Turkish President Erdogan. Of course, that would give him the chance to fly over to Istanbul anytime, but it remains to be seen how likely that is, because Zelensky has made it very clear in advance that he would only sit down face-to-face with Putin.
That's right. Now, NATO foreign ministers are also going to be holding an informal meeting in Turkey today. We've heard the NATO chief, Mark Rutte, saying he is cautiously optimistic about progress towards peace in Ukraine, but that it is up to Russia to take the next steps that are necessary. We're going to take a quick listen. I'll come right back to you, Julia.
Ukraine is ready to commit to a ceasefire and immediate negotiations. That's absolutely clear. The ball is now clearly in Russia's court. They have to explain what they are doing, why they are here or not, and with what team or whatever. But let's make sure that we all understand that the ball is in their court. Ukraine is wanting to start the negotiations as soon as possible. And as I said before, it is thanks to the Americans and President Trump that the deadlock has been broken. It's now up to the Russians to make sure they take the next steps necessary.
All right, the ball is clearly in Russia's court, we just heard there. So what will the NATO foreign ministers meeting today, what are they going to be expecting from these peace talks in Turkey?
Well, the NATO foreign ministers are meeting in southern Turkey in Antalya today, mainly to discuss defense spending in the alliance. But of course, the Ukraine-Russia talks are taking a big spotlight too. We've just heard NATO Secretary General Rutte with a more optimistic tone, but we've also heard quite different statements from the Estonian foreign minister, for example, who said that Russia sending a low-level delegation to Turkey for these talks, let me quote him, was like a slap in the face. Now, it remains to be seen, of course, also what the Americans will do. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is in Antalya. He's expected here in Istanbul tomorrow, together with U.S. senior envoys Witkoff and Kellogg, and then it remains to be seen what these talks will bring. We're hearing they might start this afternoon, how Ukraine will position itself, because we also know that Zelensky said the West should really act tough with new sanctions in case Putin doesn't show up here. So this is certainly an expectation also on with regards to the West and what their next steps are.
We can just talk about Turkey, President Erdogan, for a second, Julia. He's hosting these talks, sort of presenting himself as a potential peacemaker. How important is it for Turkey to be such a big player in all of this?
Oh, it's very important for President Erdogan to hold such big global sway, to be seen as an important actor, a possible mediator in this international conflict, key conflict. He has offered many times since Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 to host peace talks. He's repeatedly invited President Putin to come to Turkey. In fact, the first peace talks a few weeks into the war, they took place in Turkey, in Antalya, and then in Istanbul. We all know they failed, but later Turkey helped mediate a landmark grain deal and several prisoner exchanges. So they have been quite effective here. Erdogan himself, he maintained good ties with both Kyiv and Moscow throughout the war. Zelensky appears to trust him. There are regular contacts and exchanges with the Kremlin too. Of course, it's important to mention that Turkey also depends to a certain extent on Russia when it comes to oil, gas and tourists. So in any case, whatever the outcome of these talks here in Istanbul, it's very important for President Erdogan that they are taking place here, because it really helps him boost his international image.
I'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much for that, Julia. That's DW's Julia Hahn reporting from Istanbul. And we can speak now to military and security expert Gustav Gressel. Good morning to you. What do you make of the Russian president not attending the peace talks with Ukraine in Turkey?
Well, it was roughly as expected. Basically, the whole idea of hosting this talk was a diversion. The West tried to put up a unified front behind the idea of a 30-day truce or a ceasefire. Putin didn't like that, and he kind of suggested immediately these negotiations in order not to have to talk about the 30-day ceasefire. Now, these talks will end without results, and the war will go on, which is the result Putin wants.
So Russian officials have been portraying Russia as winning on the battlefield, and so it should get what it wants. What message do you think the Russian delegation will be delivering at these talks?
Yes, the Russians are pretty confident that they will win the war. Whether they will do it and the way they do it, that will be seen. But they basically see that U.S. military supplies to Ukraine will run out. There's no new package that is coming after the Biden administration's aid packages will be delivered. So they're playing for time. That's the most important fact. The other thing is, of course, they will set up demands on Ukraine seizing territories that Russia never ever controlled during the war. They will demand a dismantling of the Ukrainian army. They will demand Russian rights to interfere in Ukrainian domestic politics, be it on language law, be it on deciding who can be elected. All these kind of deep interferences Ukrainians are not going to accept. They are fighting this war exactly to become independent from Russia. So that's basically what they're fighting about, and parties will depart on that.
President Zelensky has been really clear, saying that he wants to negotiate with Putin directly. Now that's not going to happen. Can Ukraine still gain anything from these talks?
Well, the main message or the main aim for Ukraine in this talk is not to look as the party that is abandoning the talks in the eyes of Donald Trump. Even if the Trump administration or Donald Trump as a president withdraws from negotiations because he's fed up with it, it will depend on what conditions he might withdraw or continue that. Or will there be another aid package? Will he even allow European countries to, for example, or Ukraine to purchase Patriot interceptors, for example, or other weapon systems, dearly needed munitions? Or will he block that and declare a kind of American neutrality that does not supply Ukraine or does not allow any supply to Ukraine? That will make a huge difference in the war, and hence, of course, Ukrainians fight for the hearts and minds of the American president. But they're very well aware that Putin is not going to talk until the day, or not going to talk seriously until the day that he sees he can't win the war militarily, and that day hasn't come yet.
So do you think that Russia is under any real pressure from the US and other Western countries to, to broker a lasting ceasefire deal with Ukraine?
No, absolutely not. We saw the big disappointment yesterday, the EU sanctions on 180 Shadow Fleet tankers who were already under US sanctions. The US sanctions on this are much more effective. So basically a purely symbolic act. There is not a big amount of pressure coming from the West. Also, Donald Trump only talks about sanctions or tariffs. They probably won't hurt the Russians, who have rerouted their economic ties, financial ties, defense industrial ties, particularly towards China. And the Chinese will continue to support them. So Putin does not feel at all any pressure to move on or to get into any phase of constructive and substantive talks. What we see now are performative talks to stall and to fight for time and to kind of keep Donald Trump busy with other things than pondering about sanctions or whatever Lindsey Graham proposes. And so far the Russians are successful with that.
Military and security expert Gustav Gressel, thank you so much for your insights.